Olivia Bennett stepped out of the hospital, the afternoon sun casting golden streaks on the asphalt, creating a shimmering effect on the street. The soft rustling of falling leaves in the wind formed a gentle melody, setting the backdrop for the hurried footsteps of people passing by. It was a late afternoon, an ordinary one for her, but one that she would remember forever. Olivia was 6 months pregnant. The baby inside her had begun moving vigorously, as though eager to experience the world outside her womb. She felt gentle kicks, occasionally sharp jabs that made her stop and place her hand on her belly, smiling softly. The sensation of happiness spread through her, knowing that new life was forming within her. Yet today there was something unusual in the air. She noticed eyes watching her from the windows of shops, not with concern, but with scrutiny, the kind of gaze one would expect from strangers waiting for an opportunity. This feeling slowly made her heart race, and she sensed an unease lingering in the air. The familiar streets of her city, where she had grown up, no longer felt the same. Olivia had once been proud of her life here. She knew every corner, every neighborhood, every shop, and even the people walking by. But since her pregnancy, everything had started to change. The neighborhood, which once felt like a safe haven, now seemed filled with invisible threats. She had heard stories of incidents happening nearby, of criminals who didn't just hide in the shadows, but were brazen, waiting for the right moment to strike. She adjusted her handbag, feeling its rigid weight on her shoulder. Her steps grew quicker, though her heart still felt heavy. She knew she couldn't let fear take over, but sometimes the feeling crept into her mind, making it impossible not to worry about what was to come. As she passed a quiet alley, she noticed a black car parked by the side of the road. Its windows were dark, hiding the inside, yet the hum of the engine still rang steadily. The car wasn't moving, just standing still, which made it seem even more suspicious. Olivia tried not to look at it, but a part of her couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. She told herself to keep walking, not to pay attention to anything beyond her control. But just moments later, the car started moving behind her. It kept a safe distance, not too close to be noticed, but close enough to make Olivia feel like she was being followed. Her steps quickened, but the car did not leave her side. This wasn't a coincidence. Something wasn't right. She turned into another street, trying to shake the car off her trail. But when Olivia glanced back, the car was still there, only a few meters behind her. Had she ever felt this afraid? No. Though she had lived in this city all her life, it now felt entirely unfamiliar. It felt as if someone was watching her every move, tracking her every step, like a predator waiting for the right moment. Olivia took her phone out of her back sweating cold. She knew what to do, but her hands trembled, unable to dial Daniel's number. She didn't want to worry him, but at that moment, she realized she couldn't continue alone. Just as she was about to press the call button, the car suddenly stopped right in front of her. A man in a black coat stepped out. His gaze was cold, emotionless, as though he already knew exactly who she was. Olivia stood frozen, clutching her handbag, feeling the cold sweat running down her spine. He stepped closer, and Olivia realized he wasn't just some random stranger. He was a man with intent. Olivia tried to stay calm, but her heart felt like it was plummeting into an abyss. "I don't want trouble. I just want to go home," she said, her voice choking. But the man only smiled coldly, then spoke clearly. "What's in your belly? You know, there are people who won't let you or this child live in peace." Cold sweat began to pour out, and Olivia felt a terrible wave rising within her. She looked around, but there was no one to help. It felt like being trapped in a game she couldn't escape. The man's steps came closer, and Olivia knew she had to act immediately. But a familiar, warm feeling from behind her made her turn, and when she saw Daniel's gaze, her heart shattered. Daniel stood firm, his eyes cold as ice. No panic, just resolve and love for Olivia. She's not someone you touch, Daniel said in a deep, threatening voice, leaving no hope for the criminal. Olivia and Daniel's eyes met for a brief but meaningful moment. At that moment, Olivia knew she was no longer alone. She no longer had to face this battle by herself. And so, their fight began, not just for the survival of their family, but for a greater cause, justice and safety for everyone like her. Olivia entered a quiet space. The stillness of the afternoon only heightened the sense of unease within her. Only a few minutes left until she would be home, but at that moment, a strange feeling overtook her mind. It felt like a faint noise behind her, as if someone was following her, even though she had turned around and saw no one. Yet with every step, her feet felt lighter, as if everything around her had changed, and only she hadn't noticed it. As she walked past a street quieter than usual, she suddenly felt a shift in the atmosphere. The leaves had fallen, and the silence in the air was almost eerie. Olivia felt a cold breeze pass through the fabric of her coat, making her shiver. She wasn't sure if it was the tension or the growing anxiety inside her, but suddenly everything in front of her seemed too distant, no longer as sharp as it had been. Even though she had lived her whole life in this neighborhood, a place she once felt protected, it now felt unfamiliar, like a new world she couldn't understand. Then, the sleek black car appeared. Quietly, like a shadow, it parked by the side of the road, not far from her. With a quick glance, Olivia felt that something wasn't right. The car had no driver stepping out, no door opening, but the sound of the engine still hummed steadily, like a threatening reminder. She continued walking, but suddenly felt her feet growing heavy, as if an invisible force was pulling her back. The feeling was so strong that she had to stop. She cautiously turned around, and this time, the car had started moving behind her. This feeling was being followed, a familiar sensation, unmistakable. She looked ahead, but her heart was pounding in her chest. This wasn't a coincidence, this wasn't a mistake. The feeling was so clear that Olivia knew she was being watched. Deliberately, without thinking, she pulled her phone from her bag. Her fingers trembled, her palms sweaty, but she tried to hold herself together, not letting panic take over. She knew she had to call Daniel, but then she stopped. She didn't want to worry him, didn't want to pull him into this stressful situation. Every time she thought of him, of the peaceful life they once built together, her heart tightened. But now, with this threat approaching, she knew she couldn't pretend to be calm anymore. She quickly turned to dial Daniel, but as her finger touched the screen, the car suddenly stopped right in front of her. The car door opened, and a man in a black coat stepped out. His figure was tall, walking confidently, as if every step was carefully calculated. His gaze was indescribable, cold, unwavering, as if he knew exactly who she was. He wasn't in a rush. Each of his steps was like a warning. Olivia stood still, not daring to move. She could feel the tension in every fiber of her being, as though her body was no longer her own. She could only stand there, gripping her handbag, her fingers almost tearing the zipper open, but unable to let go. An overwhelming fear made every cell in her body tighten. He stepped closer, not saying a word, just standing in front of her. His gaze now wasn't cold anymore, but filled with contempt, as if he were savoring every moment of her weakness. Finally, he spoke, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. "What's in your belly? Don't you know that there are people who won't let you and this child live in peace?" Each word he said was like a stab to her heart. Olivia felt her heart shatter, but she couldn't allow herself to fall apart. Though her body trembled and her eyes blurred with panic, Olivia still tried to stay calm. She straightened up, looked directly at him, and spoke firmly. I don't want trouble, I just want to go home. But there was no relief in his words. His gaze grew more dangerous, like a predator playing with its prey. But you don't have a choice, he said, taking another step toward her. Sweat beaded on Olivia's forehead. That was the moment she knew this situation was no longer simple. The fear she felt didn't just come from instinct, but from a clear understanding. She was being watched by forces greater than her, forces that would not let go easily. Just as everything seemed about to collapse, Olivia felt a familiar presence behind her. It was none other than Daniel, her husband, standing there. His gaze was cold, yet filled with determination and protection. Olivia couldn't control the emotions rising inside her, her eyes widening. And for the first time during this tense moment, she felt a wave of relief. Daniel didn't say a word, just stood there, his feet planted firmly, his eyes unwavering, his gaze cold as ice. The man turned around, his face momentarily changing, but only for a second. Daniel spoke coldly. She's not someone you touch. It wasn't a challenge, but a statement, an undeniable declaration. Olivia and Daniel's eyes met for a brief moment, filled with resolve and love. At that moment, Olivia knew she was no longer alone in this fight. She no longer had to face this battle on her own. And so, their fight began, not only for the survival of their family, but for a greater cause, justice, and safety for everyone like her. As Daniel stepped forward, steady as a wall, his gaze turned colder, more resolute. Every step, every word he spoke was a declaration of war that could not be undone. With Olivia by his side, she understood that this fight was not just for herself, but for everything they believed in. The fear no longer overwhelmed her. Instead, there was a strength, a belief that nothing could shake. In that moment, Olivia didn't just see a strong husband, but a warrior ready to protect their family, no matter what. She gripped his hand tightly, preparing for the confrontation ahead. The next day, in the quiet of the room, Olivia sat by the window, the faint light filtering through the curtains, casting a soft glow on her face. The sounds of the city still echoed outside, but to her, everything seemed distant and muted. Her mind was deeply immersed in the events of the previous night. Although Daniel had safely brought her home, Olivia couldn't shake the heavy feeling in her heart. She couldn't ignore what had happened, nor what might come next. The invisible shadows of the night still haunted her, lurking behind the windows and beneath the streetlights. While she pondered, Daniel paced the small room, his eyes never leaving the map spread out on the table. He didn't say anything, but the tension in every movement of his spoke volumes. Last night, he had faced the enemy, those who had once hidden in the dark, but now they were no longer hiding. They had emerged, revealed in this world, and perhaps now was the time the real battle would begin. Olivia looked at him, full of worry. She knew Daniel was strong, someone who would protect her until the end. But this fight was not going to be simple. She couldn't stop thinking about the deep shadows within the city, the underground forces that were still hiding, and the people they didn't yet know. She wondered if these were just ordinary criminals or if they were connected to a larger organization, a force that could overthrow everything she was trying to protect. Daniel put the map down and turned to look at her. His eyes remained cold, as they had been after what had happened, but there was a resolute determination in them that couldn't be shaken. "We can't let them roam free anymore," he said, his voice firm. "They dare to touch my family, the one I love most. I will find them, and this time, they won't escape." Olivia squeezed his hand, feeling the resolve in his palm. But she also sensed something else. She knew Daniel was someone who would never back down, but this time, she felt a deep worry within him. He was not just fighting to protect his family anymore, but to face a force greater than he had imagined. These weren't just ordinary criminals. These people had been lurking in the dark, and once they stepped out, they wouldn't stop easily. Olivia looked into Daniel's eyes, feeling his determination, but she couldn't help but worry about what might come next. She knew he wouldn't let anyone hurt her or their child, but this battle might lead to things beyond their control. That evening, as the city lights began to fade and the darkness descended, Daniel received a call. A strange voice echoed through the phone, cold and menacing. "I know you're looking for me, but if you want to live in peace, leave us alone. This is your final warning." The voice broke off, followed by a chilling laugh full of implication. Daniel stared at the screen, his face unchanged. The coldness in the voice, the certainty in each word, made him realize that this wasn't just an empty threat. This was a real force, a formidable enemy that had emerged from the shadows to challenge him. Olivia stood beside him, feeling the atmosphere grow heavier. She looked into his eyes, but this time, she didn't see worry. Instead, there was a light of determination, a fire that had ignited within him. Daniel wasn't afraid. He had fought and survived many challenges, but this time was different. These criminals didn't just want money or power. They were testing him, testing his ability to protect what he held most dear. But one thing Daniel knew for sure: no matter how things changed, he would never give up on Olivia and their child. At that moment, Olivia understood that the days of peace they had might be over. The fight was no longer just for their family's survival. It was a struggle for justice, for the existence of a world where they could live without fear, without having to run. Daniel had made his decision, and Olivia knew that she would always stand by him, no matter what came next. The next morning, before the sunlight had fully broken through, Daniel took the first steps of the fight. He couldn't allow the enemy to continue reigning in the shadows. He couldn't let them escape his grasp. Every action he took was carefully calculated. Every step had been prepared in advance. Olivia stayed close by his side, offering her unconditional support with every step. She understood that not everything would go as they hoped in this fight. But what mattered was that they would fight, not just for themselves, but for the values they believed in. Together, they would push back the darkness, and most importantly, they would hold on to their faith in a just world, a world where no one could hide in the shadows. And so, the darkness had been unveiled, but the fight had only just begun. The room was dim, with only the soft yellow light from the desk lamp casting a warm glow on the maps and documents scattered across the table. Olivia sat opposite Daniel, her gaze fixed on him, but her heart was full of confusion. She felt as if she was standing at a crossroads with no way to turn back. In just one night, their peaceful life had been completely turned upside down. But amid that uncertainty, one thing was clear: Daniel would not stop. And perhaps neither would she. After last night's call, both of them knew they could no longer live in indefinite fear. The force behind the group of criminals was too powerful and elusive. They couldn't just sit there and wait for what would happen next. The threat was no longer just about one person. It had crossed into their family's territory. This was not just about Olivia and the child she carried, but about the fight for justice, for a society where the weak didn't have to live in fear. Daniel had already started preparing. Every step, every decision was carefully considered. But in his eyes, Olivia saw an unwavering determination. She knew he wasn't just fighting for their family, but for something much bigger than that. What he had endured in the past, what he had survived, would now be his tools to confront the underground forces. Olivia could not sit idly by. What had happened to her, to the child she carried, made it impossible for her to retreat. She was not the kind of woman to sit waiting in the dark, and though she was afraid, she knew this battle belonged to both of them. Daniel looked at her, saying nothing. He knew she wouldn't give up, but he also understood that facing the truth about what awaited them would change everything. The following days passed with meetings, plans being drawn, every tiny detail being calculated. Both of them remained silent, not speaking too much about what was to come. Olivia felt the tension radiating from Daniel. Each decision he made was a blow to her heart. Every time he left the house, she felt an invisible anxiety. But she didn't stop him. She knew that once they had gone this far, there was no turning back. One early morning, before the sunlight had fully pierced the room, Daniel sat in front of the computer screen, its light illuminating his face, revealing the tension and fatigue in him. He was looking at a map of the city, and finally his gaze stopped at a specific location. It was where the criminal group was most active. He had enough information, but the big question was whether or not to take action. Olivia entered the room and sat gently beside him. She didn't need to ask. She knew what he was thinking. "Are you going?" she asked softly, yet with determination. Daniel didn't turn to look at her, but he nodded. "We have no other choice, Olivia," he said, his voice low and certain. "If we don't go, they will find us again. They won't leave us alone." Olivia took a deep breath, her mind swirling with 1,000 questions, but they all passed in an instant. She looked at his face, where only quiet resolve remained. Despite the worry, despite the fear, she knew that if they didn't act now, there would be no more chances. "You know I won't leave you," she whispered, her hand gripping his tightly. Daniel turned to look at her, his eyes now calm and resolute. "You can stay, Olivia. You don't have to come." But Olivia immediately shook her head, not allowing him to continue. "No, we do this together. You need me," she said without hesitation. "We've faced too much together. Now it's time to face this enemy." Silence. Daniel didn't say anything more. He understood. In this situation, support didn't come from words but from actions, from the determination of both of them. And no matter how dense the darkness, they would walk through it together. At this moment, the plans were complete. Daniel had enough information about the criminal's gathering place, and he knew this was the only chance to act. Both of them prepared to leave the house, bringing the necessary weapons and anything that could help them protect themselves. Daniel pulled out his phone, dialed a number, and contacted an old friend, a former teammate from his military days. The words "start now" were all that needed to be said. Olivia stood by the window, the faint light casting a glow on her belly. She no longer felt fear. Her heart felt ready. She turned back to look at Daniel once more, her gaze resolute. Though a part of her still tightened with worry, she knew this was the decisive step. They had come too far in this journey. With all preparations complete, Daniel and Olivia stepped out of the house. No more words spoken. They didn't need to say anything else. It was time to face the darkness. But more than anything, they walked with the belief that this fight wouldn't just be a single battle. It would be the turning point for everything they were fighting for. And no matter what they had to face, they would not give up. The city was engulfed in darkness. But for Daniel and Olivia, the only light was the fiery determination burning inside them. As they stepped through the door, there were no hesitant footsteps, only firm sounds, like seasoned warriors preparing to face their decisive battle. Daniel held Olivia's hand. The silence between them spoke volumes, as though they both understood without words. This battle was no longer just about the two of them. It was about the values they wanted to protect, about their family, and the last opportunity to eliminate the ghosts in society that had tarnished justice. Everything had been carefully prepared. After days of contemplation and planning, they knew they could not hesitate any longer. This was not an ordinary confrontation. It was the final chance to destroy the root of the evil that had stolen their peace, their family's safety, and, most importantly, their belief in fairness. The city was no longer safe as it once was, but with every step they took, The perpetrators hiding in the darkness could feel the change. They were no longer invisible shadows, but a dark cloud about to be dispersed. As they entered the location Daniel had identified, they stepped into a place filled with dark memories of those who manipulated power, those puppets who knew no fear. They were not facing ordinary criminals. They were up against an underground empire, where power was not just held in wealth, but in fear. The paths they were walking on were places no one dared to tread, places where the powerful and wealthy controlled everything. But today, Daniel and Olivia had chosen to defy it. They stood in the darkness of an abandoned area, the dim lights from the cars outside casting faint streaks in the dead silence. Daniel stood still, listening to the sounds around him, calculating every possibility. Suddenly, the sound of another car came from a distance. This was the moment they had to act. Olivia stood beside him, the traces of worry on her face growing deeper. But she was no longer just an observer. She didn't want to stand by and watch Daniel fight because she knew that in this battle, it was only the two of them, no one else. She had learned from him that fear was only a temporary emotion, and that belief and determination were what would guide them through any trial. "We in it today," Olivia said, her voice steady, full of commitment. Her words were like a miracle, adding strength to Daniel. Every step they took was filled with determination, as if everything around them was standing still, waiting for this very moment. As Daniel and Olivia continued to move inside, they realized that every corner of this warehouse could be a trap. But Daniel had prepared for every situation. He knew that their enemies didn't just rely on brute force. They played dangerous games that made everything murky, where no one could predict the next move. Suddenly, a gunshot rang out. Olivia flinched, but she was not afraid. She had already seen everything that was coming. The darkness was about to be unveiled. Daniel quickly dropped to the ground, pulling Olivia into a dark corner. The people in the warehouse had been alerted. The criminals were ready to face them. Daniel blinked, his face unchanged. He knew this was the final battle, and they could not afford to fail. The sound of the enemy's footsteps grew louder, a steady rhythm, but not rushed. They were confident, knowing that their adversaries were just two people. But they didn't know that, at this very moment, the one they considered weak, the smallest threat, would be the one to make them pay dearly. Daniel had prepared in advance. Every trap, every escape route, and all the necessary weapons were in place. But the most important thing was their mental preparation. When the criminals stepped into the corner, where they thought Daniel and Olivia would be trapped, Daniel acted. He swung his arm, a flash of light in the darkness. A punch to the first man sent him straight to the ground. A swift turn, and the second man was struck next. But the criminals weren't so easy. One of them pulled out a gun. Olivia immediately spotted it and rushed forward, delivering a powerful kick to the man's hand. The gun fell to the ground, but they didn't give up. These criminals had prepared for a confrontation, but they hadn't prepared for the resolve Daniel and Olivia carried in their hearts. The punches continued to land. The strategies they had outlined beforehand started to pay off. In just a few short minutes, half of the group had fallen, but a few more aggressive ones still refused to surrender. Daniel looked at Olivia. Their eyes met for a brief moment. Olivia nodded, and Daniel continued the fight. Every move he made was precise, from punches to kicks, from patience to surprise attacks, all aimed at one goal: to end this battle once and for all. Finally, only the leader remained, the one they had been searching for all along. He stood opposite them, a cold smile on his face. But his confidence couldn't hide the fear that was slowly overtaking him. "You think you'll win?" he sneered. "You're just pawns in a bigger game. Even if you kill me, this game will continue." Daniel didn't give him a chance to speak further. He charged forward, cornering him quickly and placing his hand on his neck. "This game ends today. This evil must end, Daniel said, his voice firm and cold. The man struggled, but the determination in Daniel's eyes made him admit defeat. The underground forces had fallen under the weight of the truth, and this battle had ended. In the silent space, only the heavy breathing of the defeated criminals could be heard. Finally, the darkness was dispelled, and light shone back into Daniel and Olivia's lives. They were no longer the ones who feared, no longer the ones who ran. They had won, not just for themselves, but for everything they believed in. And in this moment, Olivia knew that they had done what no one dared to dream. They had eradicated evil at its root, bringing peace to themselves and to the world around them. When it seemed like everything was over, when the light had pierced the darkest corners of the city, Olivia couldn't help but feel a numbness in her body. Everything, from the intense battles to the important decisions, had left a deep mark on her mind. Although they had won, and the darkness had been pushed back, the cost of this victory was not small, especially for Olivia. The peace she once had seemed impossible to regain so easily. She looked at Daniel, who had stood by her side throughout the battle, but now, in his eyes, she saw something indescribable, perhaps fatigue, or the lingering fear after each fight, or simply the things he had endured throughout this long journey. The invisible wounds, the deep scars within his mind that only time could heal. Meanwhile, she couldn't deny the fact that the wounds on her body, the bruises, the blows, were not something that could be healed by medicine alone. But the greatest wound was the thing she had witnessed, what she had gone through, the memories that couldn't be erased, brutality and helplessness during the darkest moments. Even though the victory had freed them from a great danger, it also forced them to face consequences they hadn't anticipated. Daniel knew that although their enemy had been defeated, the underground forces he represented still existed, still quietly involved in dark deeds in the shadows. This victory was just a small part of the long battle they had to continue facing. Throughout their journey, Daniel had realized that no victory could be considered eternal as long as evil existed in different forms. Olivia walked beside him, but said nothing. She understood that what had happened was not the complete end. As they left the area that had once harbored these crimes, their heavy footsteps reflected everything they had been through. Outside, the day was bright, the city had awakened, but inside them, the wounds had not yet healed. Every morning when they woke up, they had to face the question, could they continue living in this world, or would everything repeat? When they arrived home, Daniel sat at the table and sighed. He was no longer the hero of the story. He was just a man who had endured too much and wasn't sure how much longer he could carry the burden. Questions flooded his mind. Would they have enough strength to fight again? Was there really a peaceful future for their family? And how long would the wounds he and Olivia carried haunt them? Olivia looked at him, knowing that now the silence between them was not a break in their connection, but a deep understanding. She knew the wounds were not just her own, but theirs together. The sense of an uncertain future had engulfed them like a wave, making everything around them seem blurred. They had overcome this battle, but the mental scars, the irreplaceable losses, would remain forever. Olivia, though still calm on the outside, felt the weight pressing deep within her. She had once thought life would be easier after the victory, but now she knew everything was never that simple. Every decision, every action had consequences. What she had witnessed, the deaths, the confrontations, these would always be imprinted in her mind, and no matter how hard she tried to forget, she knew they would always resurface. That night, Olivia couldn't sleep. She sat on the bed, looking out the window, where the moonlight gently illuminated the city. She thought about the child in her womb, and an uneasy feeling washed over her. She wondered if this baby would have to live in a world where she couldn't protect it from those shadows. Although they had won a major battle, she couldn't stop worrying about the future. Her family's safety wasn't just about weapons and plans. It was about believing in a fair world, a place where she could trust that her child would live in peace. After a sleepless night, Daniel stood up, walked to the window, and joined Olivia in looking out. He said nothing, but his presence was everything she needed. No more words were necessary. Together, they stood there, silent, watching the distant city lights flickering beneath the night sky. Why had they fought? For their own survival, for the future of their child, or for ideals they never abandoned? Olivia didn't know, but she understood that no matter how difficult it got, no matter how deep the wounds were, they wouldn't give up, because the only thing they had left was love and perseverance. And from that, they would continue their lives. A life not easy, but their own life where they could stand firm and control their destiny. The wounds may not have healed yet, but they would become the driving force for them to keep fighting for what they believed in. The city was living in a terrifying silence, as if everything was waiting for an inevitable event. On nights like this, when everyone was fast asleep, there were some who were wide awake in the dark, preparing for the final confrontation. Daniel could feel the tension building in the air. It wasn't a new sensation, but one he had experienced before in dangerous situations, where life and death were separated by mere seconds. But this time, he wasn't fighting alone. Olivia, though worried, had not given up. Both of them knew that this was a decisive moment. They had done everything they could, gathered information, made detailed plans, prepared weapons, and figured out how to resolve the threat from their enemies. Yet, even when everything was ready, he couldn't shake the feeling of unease. Daniel had fought in many battles, but this one, with all its dangers and uncertainties, seemed unlike anything he had faced before. Olivia looked into his eyes, and in her gaze, he saw the resolve and trust she had in him. But there was something in her he couldn't fully understand, her silence. She didn't ask anything, didn't mention what they were about to face, simply stood by his side as if she understood that no words could change the truth. The world had changed, and they could not go back. Everything seemed to be going according to plan. They had tracked the location where the criminal group was meeting, a place where Daniel believed the end of everything would occur. This was a confrontation they couldn't retreat from. They were too close to give up. But every time they neared the area, the tension escalated, as if threats were lurking in the dark, waiting to pounce. Now, as the daylight faded and the city descended into darkness, everything began to sharpen. Daniel had chosen the right moment to act. The leader of the crime group had no idea he was being watched at every step. But what was even more frightening was the calm of the enemy. His underlings, the puppets in this game, remained composed, as if they had nothing to fear. But they didn't know that in the darkness, the ones they considered weak were not as simple as they appeared. Suddenly, Daniel's phone buzzed, startling him. A text message. A brief message, but enough to make him cautious. "We know where you are." That was all. Those words felt like a warning. But within Daniel, he sensed the enemy's calmness. They knew, and now it was just a matter of time before the battle began. The minutes that followed grew suffocating. Neither of them spoke, only listened to the surrounding sounds, waiting for what was to come. Olivia couldn't help but feel the rising anxiety. She knew that while Daniel had prepared everything, this was not a fight for just one person. This was a fight for both of them. One person couldn't face the truth that the underground forces still existed. These criminals were not only about brute force, but also cunning tricks. They would never allow anyone to strike against them without paying a steep price. Daniel adjusted his gun in his belt and stood up. He looked at Olivia once more, as if making sure she was ready. At that moment, the sound of a strange car approached from outside. They heard the engine go almost silent as it turned onto a narrow street. Daniel took Olivia's hand, pulling her along as they began moving toward the designated meeting point. Each step felt like time was ticking down, and in this tense atmosphere, a single second could decide life or death. When they arrived, the darkness was thick, with only dim lights from the surrounding cars illuminating the bumpy road. The sounds around them felt strange, making Olivia's heart race in her chest. It wasn't simple fear, but the feeling that something was about to happen, like a storm was ready to hit. Suddenly, from the darkness, cars sped toward them, stopping right in front of them. Daniel's face remained unchanged, but inside, every fiber of his being was tensed, ready for whatever might happen. The leader had arrived, and now it was time to face everything. As everything unfolded rapidly, Daniel and Olivia realized that despite their thorough preparation, the unpredictable still lurked in every corner. A single mistake could bring everything crashing down, but they had no other choice but to keep moving forward. The darkness thickened as the sounds of footsteps drew closer, and then a loud noise came from behind. A truck sped toward them. Daniel immediately pushed Olivia to the side and jumped into the darkness, avoiding the danger. The only choice they had was survival. They couldn't let the enemy gain the upper hand. This tension was a blend of resilience and desperation. Daniel knew this fight would not be easy, that every passing second carried uncertainty, but what troubled him most was the asymmetry in this battle. The criminals were perhaps accustomed to such tactics, but for Daniel and Olivia, this was their first time stepping into a fight not just to protect themselves, but everything they held dear. And then, just as everything seemed to reach its climax, a flash of light appeared in the distance. Another car, rushing toward them, brought the help they needed. The sounds of the battle began to echo, and the confrontation between them and the enemy became only a matter of time. The underground forces would have to pay the price. The tension was unbearable, but at last, hope had appeared. The dim light from the street lamps cast shadows of Daniel and Olivia as they stepped out of the car that had brought them to the area. In the darkness of the night, everything seemed blurry, but Daniel could feel each of his steps echoing in the suffocating silence. They had arrived where this battle would come to an end. In these moments, with their hearts pounding in their chests like tense drumbeats, there was no room for hesitation. Tonight, there would be no other outcome than victory or defeat. They had come too far, fought too much, and now only one thing remained: the end. Daniel held Olivia's hand tightly, his gaze unwavering, completely focused on the goal ahead. Each step they took, each breath they made, felt like taut strings stretching, and although it seemed they were walking into danger, nothing could make them turn back now. From the darkness, a voice emerged, not from the enemy, but from an old acquaintance, someone from the world Daniel had once lived in. The person recognized Daniel and Olivia from a distance. "You've made it," the voice rasped, carrying a cold humor, but there was an unmistakable hint of worry. "I've been waiting for you." Daniel didn't respond. He didn't need to say anything. All he did was move forward, heading towards the faint light ahead. They passed through the shadows, through unforeseen dangers, only to realize that this was the time to face the final truth. As they entered, everything they had prepared was in place. There was no turning back, no changing their decision. At this point, there was only one choice: to settle everything tonight. But not everything went according to plan. Suddenly, a gunshot rang out from above. One of their enemies had drawn a weapon. A shot. At first, it was a soft blast, but soon a series of shots followed, casting shadows over the cars parked nearby. Olivia stood still for a moment, but then immediately realized she couldn't stop. They had to face this. No more hesitation. Daniel rushed forward, his hands rising reflexively, quickly adjusting his stance, using all the skills he had to protect Olivia and himself. The enemies above, though numerous, could not match his speed and decisiveness. A punch landed squarely on the face of the one holding the gun, sending him crashing to the ground. But not all of the others were so easily defeated. The gunshots continued to ring out, making the atmosphere even more tense. Daniel saw the fierce resistance from the henchmen, but he didn't waver. Olivia stood still in a corner, her eyes sharp, observing, but never letting herself fall into panic. She knew that any mistake could be disastrous, but she also knew that if she didn't act, didn't support Daniel, they wouldn't have any other chance. Olivia wasn't afraid. She hadn't been from the very beginning. She wasn't just fighting for herself. She was fighting for her family, for the unborn child within her. Everything was happening too quickly, yet it felt so slow. While the criminals tried to hide, they didn't realize that Daniel and Olivia's preparations had led to this moment. Strong opponents, but without a clear plan. The gunmen weren't the main problem. The real issue was whether they could realize that everything had been exposed, and there was no escape left for them. As Daniel and Olivia neared the heart of the area, where the final confrontation would take place, they saw the leader of the crime group. He stood there, his eyes full of defiance, but there was an unmissable trace of fear. He was the one running everything, the one who had created this nightmare, and now he had to face the truth. "Let's end this, Daniel," he said, his voice no longer confident. "Did you think you could win? Do you think one battle is enough? Evil will never die." He smirked, but his gaze no longer carried the defiance it once did. It now showed fear. Daniel said nothing. He only grasped the gun in his hand steady. He hadn't understood that this battle was not just about survival. This was a fight for the values they believed in. A gun couldn't represent everything, and Daniel knew, at this moment, he had no retreat. The confrontation didn't last long. Daniel knew how to end this battle. They weren't just fighters. They were champions of righteousness, of justice. As the leader attempted to draw his weapon, Daniel quickly reacted, landing a powerful punch that knocked him out instantly. He fell to the ground, unable to continue blocking the path that Daniel and Olivia had chosen. The remaining criminals were quickly overwhelmed. Even though they outnumbered them and were well prepared, they couldn't compare to the determination of those who were resolute in eliminating evil. Finally, when the gunshots ceased, only silence remained, and Daniel and Olivia stood in the battlefield, looking at their fallen enemies. They had done it. The battle was over. Not with brute force, but with resilience, with the ideals they had fought for their entire lives. But in that silence, Daniel understood that, even though they had won today, the real fight had never ended. They could defeat this enemy, but evil, injustice, would always lurk in the shadows. And the only thing Daniel and Olivia could do was continue protecting what they loved, continue fighting for a better world, a world where they would never have to face these challenges again. As the lights from the street lamps gradually dimmed, only the dark sky above remained. Daniel and Olivia stood together. They had completed their mission. Now, everything had returned to its true nature. Not a victory, but a liberation from evil. And so, the battle ended. The battle that Daniel and Olivia endured was not just a life and death struggle. It was a lesson in perseverance, the value of love, and the courage to face the harshest of circumstances. When confronting evil, brute force does not always provide the solution. What they proved throughout their journey was the strength of the spirit, determination, and belief in themselves and the ideals they had fought for all their lives. The lessons they learned, the things they went through, will never be forgotten and will serve as the foundation for all future decisions and actions. The first lesson this battle taught Daniel and Olivia is that change does not always come from grand actions, but from the small decisions made every day. When they began this journey, neither of them could have imagined how far it would go. From their first steps, when they only wanted to protect their family, to facing a powerful underground force, they never expected to pay such a high price. But every decision they made, every action, big or small, contributed to shaping the final outcome. This makes us reflect on the small, yet powerful actions we perform daily. Maybe today you do something simple, but those actions can lead to great changes later. The second lesson is about the power of resilience in tough times. Daniel and Olivia faced countless challenges, from threats posed by brutal enemies to fears about the future. Yet, they never gave up. Their resilience did not just stem from physical strength, but from their ability to overcome mental challenges. In moments when it seemed impossible to continue, when everything appeared to collapse, they stood firm. Their resilience is a clear example that no matter how tough life gets, when we don't give up, when we persevere and trust in our goals, nothing is impossible to overcome. Another important lesson is unity and love. Daniel and Olivia fought not only for themselves, but for their family, for those they loved. They learned that when facing challenges, love is the most powerful motivator. Yes, love can make us seem weak in the eyes of the enemy, but it also creates a strength that nothing can break. When we love someone, we are ready to sacrifice everything to protect them. And love is not just found in family or friendships, but also in self-love, in the ideals we pursue. Love is the driving force that pushes us forward, the reason we don't give up when facing adversity. The final and most important lesson is that there is nothing more precious than peace and safety. Daniel and Olivia paid a hefty price to gain this safety. They fought not only for themselves, but for the higher values of justice and fairness. However, when everything had ended, when they stood amidst their defeated enemies and saw the light shining on the city, they realized that the true value of life was not in victory, but in peace, in the moments when they could live safely, no longer fearing the evil lurking around them. Sometimes, in life, we don't need to search for grandeur or grand victories. We only need peaceful moments when everything returns to normal. In the end, what this battle left us with was a deep understanding of the cost of freedom, the cost of living in a fair and equal society. Daniel and Olivia fought not only to protect their family, but also for the ideal of a world where justice always prevails, where there is no place for evil. This reminds us of the value of freedom and justice, things we sometimes forget and only realize when we pay a steep price. But nothing compares to the feeling of living in a world where we can trust in fairness and safety. Thus, the greatest lesson we can learn from Daniel and Olivia is not just about how to fight, but about how to face fear, how to stand firm when the world around us collapses. It's a lesson in resilience, in love and unity, in protecting the high values in life, and ultimately, in the longing for a more peaceful world for all.